On a quiet weekend night in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, the city is finally starting to calm down. Outside, car horns fade into the distance, street vendors close up shop, their voices getting softer and softer. Inside an old, tired-looking central bank building, only a few yellow lights are still on. Ceiling fans spin lazily over an almost empty floor. It's the kind of place that feels stuck in time. In a small corner office, a gray, beat-up printer whirs, groans, and then suddenly stops. A sheet of white paper jams halfway out. The night shift clerk frowns, lets out a long sigh. In a country where broken machines are just part of daily life, he shrugs it off. He figures, I'll call someone to fix it tomorrow. No big deal. What he doesn't know is that at the exact moment he turns his back and walks away, almost $1 billion of his country's reserves are being quietly ordered out of their account, shooting across half the world into bank accounts no one in Bangladesh has ever heard of. No guns, no masks, no dramatic shootout like in an American heist movie. Just a few cold lines of code, sent through a messaging system that almost every bank on Earth has trusted for decades, from Dhaka all the way to New York. That system has a name, Swift. To understand why one broken printer matters so much, we have to zoom out for a second. Bangladesh isn't a financial superpower. It's a crowded, low-income country that survives on garment workers sewing clothes for the world, people working overseas and sending money home, and farmers growing rice on fields that flood a little too easily. Like a lot of developing countries, Bangladesh keeps part of its savings in US dollars, parked in the place governments consider the safest vault on earth for their money, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That's where almost $1 billion of Bangladesh's reserves were sitting quietly. Until that night. When the hackers finally got into the central bank's internal systems, they didn't go after ATMs in the street. They didn't try to crack open a physical vault. They went straight for the place where every international transfer is born, the Swift terminal. From there, they pretended to be bank staff, typing out messages that looked perfectly normal, asking to move about $951 million to accounts in the Philippines and Sri Lanka. For a Bangladeshi farm family, a few $100 might be a whole year's savings. For a garment worker, an extra $10 a month might be the difference between sending a kid to a better school or not. Now imagine almost $1 billion. Money earned one small paycheck at a time, by a country that doesn't have much to spare, disappearing because someone on the other side of the world hit send. So the question in this story isn't just who did it. The bigger question is this: how does the global banking system, with all its layers of checks, all its big names that Americans trust every single day, almost lose $1 billion because of one small bank, one outdated IT room, and a handful of people in Dhaka no one's ever heard of? And there's one more question worth asking for anyone watching this in New York, California, or Saigon. If a whole country can almost be wiped out by a few lines of text on a screen, how solid is the system you and I trust with our money every day, really? If you're picturing some Hollywood-style control center with wall-to-wall screens and blinking lights, forget it. The IT room at Bangladesh's central bank that year looked nothing like that. It was just a regular office. Faded paint on the walls, a few old desktop computers that took forever to boot, cables tangled in knots under metal desks. The kind of place where the air feels a little stale and everything looks a few years out of date. And the people working there, they weren't tech superheroes, they were civil servants, the kind of folks who bring lunch from home in a metal box, ride the bus to work, and worry about paying for their kids' school. They were asked to help run a system the whole world depends on, but were never really given the tools, the training, or the budget to protect it. Later investigations showed just how fragile that setup was. The bank's internal network was poorly secured. Machines were running old versions of Windows, missing critical security patches. The firewall, if there even was a real one, wasn't strong and wasn't configured well. And the Swift terminal, the one machine that could send money messages around the world, sat on the same network as ordinary office PCs. That's like keeping the key to the vault in the same unlocked drawer as the office staplers right next to an open window. In a place like that, it doesn't take much. One email pretending to be from a vendor, one attachment that looks like an invoice. Someone in that room, busy and undertrained, trusting and trying to get through their day, clicked it. Not because they were stupid, because that's what humans do when a system expects them to be perfect with almost no support. From that single click, the malware slipped in. It watched quietly, learned how the bank worked, recorded habits, waited for the perfect moment. On the surface, this sounds like a story about a few employees messing up. But if you look closer, it's really a story about a system that demands frontline people never make mistakes while giving them almost nothing to work with. It's easy to say they should have known better. Harder to admit that in a country like Bangladesh with weak infrastructure, little training, and huge pressure, the odds were stacked against them from the start. And that's why this isn't just a story about one faraway bank. It forces us to ask a much more uncomfortable question. How many other IT rooms around the world look exactly like this small, tired office in Dhaka, fragile, understaffed, and standing alone in front of a storm they were never really prepared for? Once the hackers were inside the bank's network, they didn't rush. They did the opposite. They sat quietly and watched how people actually ran this giant financial machine. Day after day, staff in Dhaka would turn on their computers, log in, send a few small transfers, receive a few more. Same screen, same routines, same timing. Slow, repetitive, boring. And that boredom was exactly what the hackers needed. It gave them a perfect pattern to study and memorize. To them, SWIFT wasn't some mysterious acronym. They knew it well. SWIFT is basically a global postal service for banks. You don't move the money itself. You send a standardized message that says, take this amount from this account and put it into that account. If that message comes from a place you trust, you almost always follow it. So once the hackers managed to sit in the sender's chair, those messages stopped being harmless instructions. They became weapons. For weeks, they quietly recorded the way Bangladesh Bank usually sent money, the typical amounts, the names of regular partner banks, the times of day transfers were usually sent. They didn't want their first shots to look strange. Anything too weird might wake someone up on the other end. Then they picked their moment. In Dhaka, it was the weekend. The bank was basically asleep. Few people on duty, nobody expecting big transfers. In New York, it was a normal workday. The Fed was wide awake, processing thousands of payments like always. And in the Philippines, it was a holiday period. The people who normally watch for money laundering had plenty of other things on their plate. In one night, from that same familiar room in Dhaka, the SWIFT messages started rolling out. The sender was still Bangladesh Bank. The digital signature still checked out. The format of each message was flawless. On paper, nothing had changed, but the person at the keyboard wasn't a tired bank employee anymore. It was a crew of criminals who had spent months learning to imitate that employee perfectly. 35 payment orders went out, aimed at a web of accounts overseas. If you just glanced at the list, it looked like a weirdly busy day, not a robbery in progress. And that was the whole point. The closer an attack feels to business as usual, the less likely anyone is to notice. While Dhaka lay in the dark of a quiet weekend night, half a world away, machines and people were already working through some of the largest transfers Bangladesh had ever sent. None of them realized they had just become the next link in a chain designed to exploit one thing above all else: habit, trust, and the familiar rhythm of the global financial system. On a human level, the plan sounds cold, almost cruel. But it runs entirely on everyday stuff: the exhaustion of a night shift worker, the almost blind trust in the name of a central bank, the assumption that a poor country is too small, too unimportant to be worth attacking. All of those little human beliefs and blind spots got stitched together into one massive hole in the system. And no line of code inside that system, on its own, could ever fully fix that. That night in Dhaka, the city sat under its usual blanket of heat and dust. Inside the central bank, most of the lights were already off. On the lower floors, a couple of security guards sipped tea, traded stories about their families, and glanced now and then at a wall of sleepy security cameras. No one saw the real action. The real traffic wasn't on the streets. It was leaving the building as lines of code, racing through fiber optic cables, jumping under oceans. On the other side of the world, in New York, it was still business hours. In a Fed office filled with screens, an international payments analyst started reviewing the latest incoming transfer requests. Bangladesh wasn't a big, flashy client. They almost never pushed huge amounts around. So when, in the span of a single day, their account suddenly asked to move close to $1 billion broken up into dozens of payments to strange new names, it felt off. If you work with numbers long enough, you develop a weird sixth sense. On paper, everything can look technically correct and still feel wrong in your gut. One of the people on that desk stopped on a particular transaction and stared at it a little longer. At first glance, it looked like the others. Same format, Same style, same country, except for one small detail, the name of the recipient, Shalika Foundation, one letter, that was it. But it made his eyes freeze. A serious organization that manages millions of dollars doesn't usually misspell its own name. From that tiny typo, the questions started. Could this be a hacker? Did someone inside the bank get tricked? While New York quietly began digging into the transfers, back in Dhaka the printer stayed dead silent. No logs spitting out. No stack of papers on anyone's desk. The night shift staff, used to quiet weekends, had nothing in front of them that looked urgent or strange. The whole building slept, while the financial fate of their country was being decided on another continent. In the end, most of the money was stopped. Roughly $750 million never left the system. But not all of it. About $101 million still slipped through. $20 million went to Sri Lanka and was later clawed back. The remaining $81 million flowed straight into a set of accounts in the Philippines that had been waiting, empty and ready. The irony is brutal. In this high-tech crime story, the path of nearly $1 billion was shaped by two very human things: a typo in a name, and a cheap office printer breaking at the worst possible time. One made a guy in New York uneasy enough to hit pause. The other kept a team in Dhaka from realizing anything was wrong at all. Between those two extremes, the money kept moving, reminding us that this system isn't just built out of code and protocols. It's built on top of human habits, fragile routines carried by the people sitting behind the screens. From New York, the transfers that slipped through didn't stop. They kept flowing through the global banking plumbing until they finally landed in Manila. $81 million didn't show up in suitcases. No armored trucks. Just cold numbers, moving quietly through the system of a commercial bank called RCBC. The accounts waiting for that money had been opened months earlier. On paper, they belonged to people with totally normal-sounding names. But the ID behind them later turned out to be fake. For a long time, those accounts just sat there, almost empty like abandoned houses on a quiet street. Then, a few days after the hack, the lights turned on. Wave after wave of large transfers started pouring in. From those accounts, the money didn't stay put. It moved again to a currency exchange company, got converted into Philippine pesos, broken into smaller amounts, pushed back into the banking system, and then peeled off as cash and casino chips. Some of it walked straight through the doors of bright, all-night gambling floors in Manila. Rooms where VIPs sat around baccarat tables under golden lights, with a drink in one hand and a stack of chips in the other, the music loud enough to drown out any quiet conversation. In that world, there was no sign of Bangladesh. No one there was thinking about garment workers pulling overtime in Dhaka, or families living in fragile houses on the riverbank hoping the next flood won't take everything. Inside the casino, money was just thick bundles of bills. Just numbers on a slip, just colorful chips sliding across green felt. And here's the detail that really stings. At the time, casinos in the Philippines weren't tightly covered by anti-money laundering laws. Huge amounts of cash could move in and out of those places without facing the same level of scrutiny they would inside the regular banking system. The hackers knew that, and they aimed for it on purpose. By the time Bangladesh Bank finally realized what had happened and begged for the funds to be frozen, most of that $81 million had already walked through doors with no cameras, been stuffed into pockets, tucked into private safes, or bounced into fresh accounts somewhere else on the map. What was left behind wasn't the money. It was a bitter feeling that's hard to describe, the sense that the sweat of a poor country had been converted into loud nights and bright tables in a city most of its people would never see. The next morning, when someone finally got that printer working again, the first pages slid out of the tray. Line after line of swift transfers that no one in Dhaka remembered sending. The mood in the room changed fast. First confusion, then shock, then that heavy, sinking feeling of, who's going to be the one to tell the boss? Within days, the story had blown past the old walls of the central bank. It was on the front pages in Parliament and in every sidewalk tea stall conversation. The governor was grilled, officials resigned, and the whole system started doing what big systems always do in a crisis, looking for a simple answer to a very messy problem. In other words, they started looking for someone to blame. Bangladesh Bank pointed at the Fed and SWIFT. Why didn't these giant names in global finance do more to protect a small, vulnerable client? The Fed pushed back. They argued that their controls actually stopped most of the money. and that the real problem started with a weak, insecure network back in Dhaka. Swift stepped in and said their network was never breached at all, that only one member bank let the bad guys in their front door. Meanwhile, international investigators followed the trail of the malware and its fingerprints. Over time, that trail started pointing toward a highly sophisticated group of hackers believed to be tied to North Korea. RCBC in the Philippines was fined. A few people had to testify, but most of the money never came home. And in all that noise, not many people talked about the regular employees. The folks who had to come back to work in that same building every day, who had to live with the idea that a crack right where they were standing had shaken their country's trust in the system they thought was protecting it. In the end, there's something about this story that's both really simple and really terrifying. The hackers here didn't use magic. They didn't bend the laws of physics. They slipped into the right place at the right time and took advantage of habits and weak spots the system had already built in for them. An old IT room. A cheap printer that died at the wrong moment. A single misspelled word in a payment message. A money laundering plan that moved through the gray areas of the law. Behind that almost $1 billion, it's still just regular people. The civil servant sweating through his shirt in a hot office in Dhaka. The analyst in New York who stops scrolling because one letter in a name feels wrong. Millions of Bangladeshis who can only trust that signatures, stamps, and official seals are enough to keep their money and their future safe. If one typo can accidentally save hundreds of millions of dollars, what do you think happens the next time the attackers get everything perfect and don't slip up at all? This was only case one. In the next episode, we're looking at Carbonac, the crew that turned ATMs in more than 20 countries into their own personal cash machines. If you want to keep following these crime stories and the hard lessons hiding inside the systems we all rely on, hit like and subscribe to Sins and Lessons.